Hey there, YouTube. I'm Yukitsu. This is the Yukitsu Times. Welcome to my channel. Welcome to another Tuesday talk show. So yet again, we're going to be talking a little bit about Code Geass and about Death Note, of course. And this time we're going to be talking about whether or not I find them entertaining and sort of why. And we're going to start this off by saying that we're going to look at each of these in two different ways. So a medium can be about something, about deep themes and heavy interpretability and a discussion or a discourse about something philosophical or psychological or political. And sometimes they're just written to be entertaining or to just make you enjoy it or be immersed in the world. My opinion about both of these works is that they fall into the latter category. Neither of them was actually meant to be a discourse on anything philosophical or political or anything of that sort. While they both invoke ideas from that category, they're not primarily for that purpose, in my opinion. I think that both of them are meant to be enjoyed with a passive audience that's not interpreting too much of the sort of discourse from either of these mediums. But just for completeness sake, we're going to discuss each of them in both these capacities, because if I'm wrong about this, I would like to be able to discuss them in the terms about why I don't think they necessarily work as a political discourse or a philosophical one for that matter. So we're going to start off by talking about Death Note again, and this is Death Note as pure entertainment. Now, Death Note as pure entertainment works out in a very interesting way. I think I mentioned this in the previous episode where I talked about how Death Note is essentially a duel between light and L, and it's not really supposed to be anything other than that. There's no sort of conflicting morality, in my opinion, between either of them, since neither of them seems to have their own sort of moral gravity, other than if I win, then blah blah blah. It really does seem to be the main crux of the way morality works in the series, is that whoever wins is the more moral one. So there's no real discourse in that sort of capacity there. They're simply trying to win because they have big egos, in my opinion. And largely speaking, this sort of duel between each of these individuals is the main focus of the drama, because it can't be a normal criminal investigation series, it can't be a normal crime drama, it can't be anything of that sort. If we were to take a typical episode or a typical book of Sherlock Holmes, we've got that sort of element of a duel between Sherlock Holmes and the criminal, trying to outwit one another in their sort of own sort of way. But there's a much greater draw into those sort of experiences where you're trying to piece together the elements to try and come to a conclusion on your own. And that's done for you in Death Note. We know who the criminals are. We know who the players on both sides are. We know what their moves are. We know what each person is, largely speaking, doing. They hide some information for us, but what we want to know is ultimately who's going to win, and this is why it's a duel. It's not even anything like something like Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None, a unique sort of whodunit story where we know from the start, from the very premise of the story, that every single person on the island is going to die. That's implicit in what the story is. The sort of reason that you get immersed in that story is that you want to figure out the steps taken. You want to figure out who it was, despite the fact that you know that person is going to die as well. And you know the end result. You know what's going to happen, but you don't know who did it. You don't know how they did it, how they managed to succeed at it. All of that, like, even once you get to the point where you're like, it can't be these people that are left at the very end here. It cannot actually be these two. And it's not, for those of you, as a spoiler, because it's so bloody obvious that's not those two throughout the sort of story. But you can sort of try and guess at who exactly it is, and you can try and guess at, like, what the moves are going to be. That's not really something you can do in Code Geass. You're told what the moves are. You're told who the players are. You're told who's doing what. So the entirety of the drama comes down from the interplay between light and L, and then to a later extent, light and near. So why does this not necessarily work for me? Well, I've mentioned, I think, before that I don't really hold authors to a very high standard when they're trying to write intelligent characters, but that doesn't apply to Death Note. The reason is that when you're looking at a duel, the skill between the two players is ultimately what matters. If you're to make a series about, say, chess, and I was sort of reading through that, and let's say that I was an expert on chess, and the writer was a complete amateur. If that writer is saying that this is a brilliant chess player and he's making all these rookie mistakes that I, as the expert chess player, and as a disclaimer here, I'm terrible at chess. I've barely ever played it. But for argument's sake, let's say this is the case. So I'd be scanning through this and I'd be seeing none of these moves make sense. None of this is very intelligible. I'm going to get frustrated with the story and I'm going to quit. By the same token, if I think that the plans have gigantic holes in them or massive leaps in logic in them, the duel between Light and L becomes a bit farcical, and that's sort of where it went. The writer, I don't think, was capable of actually creating characters that were as intelligent as they were meant to be, and so they have to make up for that with massive leaps in logic based around the fact that the writer knows, of course, what both sides are thinking simultaneously, so you can have one character come to the correct conclusion even though they don't have any evidence to sort of get there, or they don't have sufficient evidence to get to where they end up leaping to. So, generally speaking, I think that if you're going to make this kind of duel, you have to know enough about the sort of topic at hand, about the sort of individual duel that's going to occur, whether it be planning, whether it be chess, whether it be sword fighting. Both of the characters involved have to be written by somebody who's capable of writing about that topic in a way that's believable and which is equally intelligent to those characters, and that doesn't really happen in this particular case, which draws you out of the story. There are going to be extremely passive audiences of Death Note who are going to watch the anime or read the manga that are going to buy into every single deduction made by either character, and that is perfectly fine. I'm simply not one of those individuals where I go through these and try and figure out exactly the plan. Like I was mentioning those sort of mystery novels, I'm an avid reader of mystery novels to a certain extent. There's plenty that I haven't read, so if you're going to say, well, you haven't read this one, yeah, that's absolutely true. I cannot say that I've read every single mystery novel, but when I read them, I like to go very carefully and methodically through them and look for the different threads and try and figure out who did what, and so on and so forth, and find out where the gaps in the detective's logic were when they were trying to come to their conclusion, see if it was credible for them to have come to that conclusion. For those sorts of readers who are not passive readers into this style of media, there's plenty of flaws in the way that Death Note sort of works, and the way that the characters sort of individually go about things. Like, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me that people come to the conclusion that there's some sort of supernatural hyper-efficient individual that is causing the deaths of all these inmates at the very beginning, when a whole bunch of inmates suddenly start dying. Like, that sort of coincidence can happen in real life, and we wouldn't really ascribe it to any sort of outside force. Like, people start creating, like, web pages and governmental committees after he's killed maybe a couple hundred people, and since these people are dying from things like heart attacks, there's realistically not much link they can do to say that this is caused by an individual. And autopsies would have confirmed that they had not died from any sort of poisoning that they could detect. So if there is some sort of cause to this, then it's going to have to be some sort of undetectable poison, or it's going to be coincidental, or it's going to be down to some sort of health epidemic that's going on there, or something like that. But it's not going to be something that people think is an outside person from the prison system that is capable of some sort of supernatural feat. And the series is full of these sorts of ridiculous deductions that don't make any particular sense. That's supposed to sort of display these characters as being genius, but really just come across as the author trying to write his way out of a situation, without necessarily being able to figure out a plausible thread that connects the two, sort of the conclusion that he wants to be reached and the starting point of the evidence available. So anyway, yeah, this is why Death Note I don't think really necessarily works too well as just pure entertainment, and this is why I think a lot of people that do discuss Death Note discuss it for its themes, despite the fact that I don't think that it really goes into those all that deeply either. Alright, so this brings us to our Code Geass analysis as a pure form of entertainment. Now, Code Geass has a lot of inherent advantages to it. What I was talking about with Death Note is that I lack verisimilitude, I lack immersion in it because its hyper-real setting made me analyze it as though it were reality, and it breaks apart at that level. By contrast, Code Geass is meant to be a gigantic robots anime with an atypical protagonist, meaning that I really don't have any of the sort of typical levels of verisimilitude with it. I'm willing to suspend my disbelief in a much grander sense because it's not meant to resemble reality. The bright characters, the very angular, distorted features, the fact that none of these people look quite like actual humans really helps me with disengaging from the sense that this is supposed to be real or critically thinking about it. And the fact that there, of course, are distracting explosions constantly pulling me away from close analysis of it really makes it so that this is not a series where I'm taking it too seriously. And The next advantage that Code Geass has in this sort of category of not really falling apart at the intellectual level is that most of Lelouch's opponents are not highly intelligent. We can say that some of them are pretty smart, but none of them are supposed to be geniuses. Therefore, he can rely on fairly simple plans and ruses to trick them or to get them to act the way that he wants to. And when that falls short, his particular ability is far, far more flexible than Light's is, in a certain sense there. Of course, it lacks the sort of raw power of being able to work on people that are far, far away from you, but I would definitely argue that Lelouch's ability is a lot more flexible in terms of what it's capable of accomplishing. And by the end of it, the fact that the sort of status quo that he achieves is very reliant on his power being extremely flexible. So all of that's why it doesn't fall apart in the same sort of way that I think Death Note did. But what are actually strong about the series in terms of its sort of... in what makes it interesting to watch, even though it's not necessarily going to have any deep meaning behind it, which we'll get into later. Well, it is an interesting mech series. It's got good choreographed fights that are pretty decent. It's got interesting characters with mixed personalities. It's got a very interesting protagonist that you didn't see really at that sort of time, other than in things like Death Note and Code Geass. And it had loads of interesting sort of moments and character beats that were broken up between bits of levity, bits of drama, bits of action and violence, bits of strategy. And so you honestly went through it and were willing to sort of accept that it's just a roller coaster, much more than you would be willing to accept Code Geass, Death Note as a roller coaster, because Death Note makes a terrible roller coaster. So a lot of the different sort of elements to it, if you're not a big fan of giant robots sort of smacking at other robots, then obviously Code Geass is not necessarily going to be all that interesting for you. I think that to a certain extent, even if you're willing to, if you don't particularly like giant robots as a series, I personally don't like a lot of. I personally don't like a lot of giant robot series, but this one's still pretty good if you like the sort of politics and the sort of backstabbing and the maneuver, even if a lot of it is somewhat shallow. And again, a lot of these plans that Lelouch uses are fairly simple, but I think there's some intelligence in that in and of itself. When you're not necessarily up against a strategic grand master or anything like that, there's no point in a complex or convoluted plan. Simply speaking, if you're doing something complicated, you've got more steps that can fail. Usually his plans are relatively simple and rely on the fact that other people don't know how his Geass power works. And there's no sort of there's a lot less moments in the series where people do know what his power is. So, and in those moments he does struggle a lot more and have to come up with more complex or convoluted plans. But when you've got such a powerful tool and other people don't know about it, it's very easy for you to coast by with that ability, and he does through a lot of the series where I think that it makes most sense for him to do so. Now, that does mean that there are certain moments that are a little bit immersion breaking in terms of just like, I don't think that these plans are all that really, really good, or it doesn't really portray him as being as smart as I think he should be, or as the writers want to convey him as. Pretty much once you get to the arc where he's dealing with Schneisel, that's sort of where it falls apart a little bit, since Schneisel's supposed to be smarter than him. Although admittedly he just powers him ultimately. But yeah, that element I didn't think worked quite as well as other parts of it, but for the most part, Code Geass as entertainment in the sort of purest sort of turn your brain off, go through it, is about robots fighting each other and the sort of ways that they go about fighting each other with a character that uses his brain more than he uses his bronze. And while his plans might be implausible, his actions might be implausible, they're no more implausible than a giant robot standing around flying through space in the first place. That itself is something that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. You know, there's a reason that we make tanks and not mechs in the real world. So I think that basically the genre itself really helps Code Geass free itself up to be just pure fun without having to worry about the same hang-ups that a sort of more realistic depiction would have it end up being. Alright, so going into the themes of Code Geass, and again, this is a series that I think is primarily intended for pure entertainment, just to be fun to watch and to be sort of turn your brain off and enjoy something. Maybe not completely turn your brain off. But one of the things about media is that even if they're not about the philosophy, politics, psychology, or discourse that could be expressed in it, that doesn't mean that they can't have those elements, and that doesn't mean that those things can't add to it. I think that Code Geass benefits from this less than Death Note does, but I think that it still does benefit to a certain degree about its sort of philosophy, its politics, and so on and so forth. One of the sort of main ideas behind the protagonist, deuteragonist slash antagonist dynamic in this is the idea about how to best achieve political aims when you're in an oppressive system that you need to topple. Suzaku, of course, believes in sort of cooperating with that system and trying to sort of break free from it by sort of improving it from the inside to make it more free from the inside. Whereas, obviously, Lelouch believes in open revolt and rebellion. And they sort of compare and contrast these, and it's discussed not necessarily through the actions of the characters all that well. It's not a very, very fleshed out idea, but it is the dialogue that happens between those characters, and it is what they're both fighting for. Suzaku believes in sort of integrating with Britannians to try and make it so that the people of Japan are at least given equal sort of rights to it, but doesn't believe in necessarily getting absolute freedom from them. Lelouch is more complicated in what he's actually going for, but believes in open revolt as being the only means of toppling the oppressive system. I don't think that he's in it just for specifically getting rights or getting freedoms for the Japanese people in particular, but I definitely do feel as though he does have that as one of his motivators. After all, he has lived with them for much of his life by that point in time. Other characters, of course, also have little questions and bits to their character, but those are the two main ideological sort of drives in the series. And one of the things that gets asked of both of them is what you're willing to sacrifice in favor of your ideology, in favor of your worldview, in favor of your goal. And constantly Lelouch is sort of refusing to give up on certain ideas and ideals and people in his life. He feels instant regret when he learns that he killed Shirley's father in an accidental attack. Well, not accidental attack, but he accidentally killed her father in an attack that he believes he needed to do, but would he still feel justified if he had known that ahead of time? And this is someone who is a close friend of his. He killed her father. He does regret having done that. Would he have found maybe another way to go about it? But it sort of imprints on him the idea that there is a cost to waging this type of war, and it's not necessarily one that he feels good about paying. And there are, of course, other moments where there are moments, again, he could easily have killed Suzaku several times throughout the series. And it's not simply a case of wanting him to be alive so that he can use him. Euphemia ended up being someone that he used, but that's because he already accidentally did something that he could not undo. But he was willing to give up his idea, his very goal, if it could be achieved peacefully without the bloodshed that he otherwise was going to embark upon. I think that to a certain degree, if she had failed, if she had done these things to better integrate the Japanese people, if she had failed in making a peaceful world where they could coexist happily, then I think that he would have gone full back. He would have been fine going back to being a rebel after that. But in this particular case, that didn't pan out because Lelouch is a person who is constantly thwarted at every turn by unfortunate events that are largely outside of his control and, reasonably speaking, outside of anyone's ability to predict. So, to a large extent, Lelouch is a person who has principles and, it's constantly being asked of him, are you willing to sacrifice these things? What are you willing to become to achieve your goals, and what are those goals? Which I think to a certain degree is very, very complex for him. I think that there's an element of revenge in it, but that's obviously not the only thing he's after in any sort of sense. He gets his revenge against a lot of people. I think that he's looking for an ideal sort of world, which I think that was one of the most important things for him. One of the interesting things about him as a character is that I don't think he ever actually desires power, which makes him a very stark contrast to Light, but that sort of sense is very much difficult to ascertain for sure. But I think that he's very much more goal-driven and goal-oriented, and I think that those goals really are to try and create a peaceful world. In particular, I think, again, his worldview is that it's a fairly small goal, I think. Ultimately, I think he wants to create a sort of world for Nunnally to live in, which he views as being something that's peaceful, that's pacified, where people get together and are able to cooperate. I think that that's sort of the world that he he imagines her living in. Coincidentally, I don't think that he believes he has any place in that particular world, which is why he takes the actions that he does. But that is ultimately, I think, the main ideas behind the ideology of Code Geass. It's what are you willing to do for a noble or just goal, and what does that sort of make you? I think that Code Geass is willing to say that the ends don't necessarily justify the means. Yes, you might need to get to those ends, but that does not absolve you of the sort of guilt of what you've done, of what you've sort of used to accomplish your goals there. And I think that as well, it's a much better series for saying that, you need to have an understanding of the consequences of your actions while using the power that you do have. I'm not going to go as far as to say that he needs to be responsible with those powers. It's just that you need to understand what you're doing, which he doesn't always do. And I think that sort of is a fairly simplistic political discourse and a fairly simplistic philosophical discourse. It's not much to it, honestly. And frankly, it doesn't really change much, but it does add a little bit of depth, in particular to Lelouch as a character, but also adds a little bit, of course, of depth to Suzaku as a character as well. Alright, and let's get into our last discussion bit here. So this is going to be talking about, of course, Death Note as a philosophical discourse, and this is where I think the series has the most potential, and this is why I actually really wish it was a better series than it is, because there's so much potential in it. They touch on so many different philosophical and political subjects, but they never really go anywhere with them. They make a statement about them, they point to how smart that sort of concept is, or that concept exists, but then they never go anywhere with it. And this is pretty consistent across all of the sort of themes that we can discuss here. So let's start off with one of the ones that they touch upon, which is the sort of concept of the Ring of Geass. And this is an old philosophical, ethical quandary where they ask, what would you do if you could be invisible and do whatever you wanted? Essentially, the Death Note is a good stand-in for that in this sort of metaphorical sense there. The problem is that Light doesn't really question very much about it, except for the very, very, very beginning, and that questioning is very superficial and very fast before he goes on. Most of it is incredulity that it actually works. So very rapidly he descends into the sort of mad state where he's murdering everybody. He's a crazed egomaniac, he's a sociopath that kills everybody. So there's no real counterpoint to this idea that when you're given this sort of power that you become corrupted absolutely. It would be nice if there was a discussion about it, or maybe a breakdown, and show us that this isn't the inevitable conclusion, but all they really do is show us that this one person gets this and immediately becomes evil, and sort of assumes that anyone that was given this sort of power would immediately become extremely evil right off the bat there. But there's not a whole lot of substance to this conversation in Death Note as it is. For example, every character that sort of comes across the Death Note, but which is anonymous when they come across it, really does feel as though they just immediately swing automatically and quickly to the side of just murder as many people as you feel are getting in your ideological way. And there's no sort of counterbalance to this argument, this idea. People who don't do it for that purpose, who are very reserved about using it or don't use it at all. The people who we see not using it, that do get their hands on it at some point, are people who are known to have it, and therefore if they were to use it, it would be fairly publicly known that they had used it in that sort of sense there. The next sort of idea that they touch on but don't really discuss in any sort of length is the political idea about capital punishment. In Death Note, it's sort of taken as a granted that if you execute criminals, there will be a drop in crime. And I mean, sort of, like, there's definitely not going to be any repeat offenders if you're killing every single criminal, but the fact is, we've had justice systems where we've killed pretty much all the criminals, or most of the criminals, or whatever, and this didn't really reduce criminality, and it's been sort of a status quo state for a lot of human history, and it's also a direct comparison that we can make. In some states there is capital punishment, and others there is not. And the ones that have it don't really have less criminality than the ones that do, or vice versa. It's sort of a similar statistic in some senses. So realistically, the death penalty doesn't really work, and that's ultimately what Kira is doing, is simply using a death penalty. The reason that it's not a more concrete form of divine justice is because he has to use police files to do the investigation. And in fact, This means that since these are people who have not yet been committed for a crime, or have been committed for a relatively low intensity crime, or who are potentially in an appeals process, he is probably killing a lot of innocent people. And this doesn't really get addressed properly in the series, that he is a very sloppy executioner. I think that sort of could have been more thoroughly discussed as well, the sort of idea about whether his technique is actually affecting society in a positive way. I think is just taken as a given that it is. And while I disagree with the notion that his methods would work, I disagree even more with the fact that there's never any counterpoint, and nobody ever seems to really bring this idea or concept up. The next sort of thing that we could talk about is the one that actually is a little bit substantive, and that is the question about what morality actually is. They use it as it gets referred to as justice quite often in Death Note. The problem with this is that the idea is largely a sham for the characters involved. They don't really care about it in any broad sort of sense there, once the plot sort of kicks into gear. Light, to a certain degree, is engaged in a sort of delusional self-gratification, narcissism, and this sort of self-justification for the actions that he had taken, where he had killed two people without necessarily intending to, by saying that what he's doing is right. And we could sort of analyze what the author has to say about this from the text itself in a couple of places. To a certain extent, it's directly stated that the person who wins whichever conflict it is, the winner writes history, and the person who writes history is morally correct, which we, from our position in history, have been able to condemn people who have won throughout history, and say that their actions are evil, and even parts of ourselves, if we are able to actually reflect in that sort of capacity. Some governments, of course, are unwilling to actually address the evils that their own society committed, but generally speaking, we're no longer willing to give victors of history a free pass. But within Death Note, it's stated outright that if Kuro wins, then he is justice, or something of that sort. And this thread does continue throughout the series. He beats L, and that sort of reinforces that notion. But what we should address here is the idea not of the individual winning, perhaps, but the idea of their morality winning or losing. And this is one of those interesting things. The moral action, and in the most simplified terms of Death Note, is that the person who wins is the person who can kill the other person. The other way of looking at the morality of Death Note is that the person who is capable of acting in such a way that they eliminate a murderer from society, or a criminal from society, can do so with no due process, with no repercussions, or whatever. They just kill the person without really any sort of due process or anything of that sort, no investigation into it, no justification, no understanding of the context in which it was occurring. And this mentality wins. This mentality kills Kira, because that's exactly what Matsuda does. He shoots him with no due process, no justification, other than the fact that Light was a criminal, was a traitor, had killed his father, and so on and so forth. Simply put, Matsuda was capable of beating Light at that moment, and he took that opportunity, and that would make him the moral victor in that instance. And then, of course, we get to the idea that his moral idea is still correct, because it survives through the crazy sect, cult, whatever. It's also indicated that his idea was correct, because society goes into a downslide into criminality again once he's gone. So all of those do seem to paint the idea or the picture that just if you've got the ability to do so, you should just kill people that you disagree with, and that is what justice is. I, of course, don't really think that that's a very coherent ethical statement, and it's not really discussed by its dichotomous value, because no one really opposes that sort of idea in the story or embodies a counter idea in any sort of relevant sense. So again, it's not really a dialogue. But we do, however, see the consequences of that action in that Light does die. I think his death actually ends up being inevitable, because the society at large was going to continue putting investigators in front of him until one of them caught him. And I think that was going to simply just be something that was going to happen regardless. But there's another way that we could sort of look at the morality in Death Note, and it is that there is no meaning to morality, and the whole idea is pointless. And I think that Ryuk sort of embodies that concept a little bit, the idea that there's no afterlife for which he's going to be punished for his crimes throughout his life, the idea that realistically speaking, once he does die, things revert to the way they were before, meaning that he has impacted no effective real societal change. Basically, all sort of points to the idea that the actions of the players in this are small and irrelevant and don't have any bearing on the condition of the world at large. I would say that idea is needlessly nihilistic, and I'm not necessarily sure that I believe that the text as a whole really points in that direction, but it certainly is one interpretation that you could take from it. Then, of course, there's the other argument that you could make that morality is just a subjective sort of thing there. This is a genericized sort of argument, but doesn't really get discussed in the text of Death Note in any sort of way, but they certainly don't believe that there is an objective sense of right or wrong in the world. And they also don't seem to believe in nuance or shades of gray in the way that they deal with criminals. You're either guilty and deserve death, or you're not guilty and whatever the hell. So there's a lot of nuance that's missing from that argument, and there's also a lot of sort of different sides that need to be addressed better in this argument. So that's ultimately why I think Death Note fails if we're talking about it as a sort of philosophical or a political discourse. It does touch upon really big ideas that could be much, much bigger and much more interesting than the ideas touched in Code Geass, which are fairly simple and fairly non-existent in the text itself. The themes and ideas of Code Geass are fairly shallow, but at the same time, the fact that they've touched on all these ideas and really didn't deliver on any of them leads me to sort of view it preferentially as just a procedural thriller, as a crime sort of thriller where the characters are engaged in a duel of wits against one another and there's no sort of underlying philosophy to it. It's just a chess match between two people who are not necessarily that great at chess. And ultimately, that's, I think, why Death Note just isn't necessarily that great. By contrast, Code Geass's ideas, while simplistic and not really well discussed, at least do enhance to a certain degree the characteristics of the individual players of their story. And more than that, it is just a fun romp with robots and explosions and politics and stuff like that, which aren't really thoroughly discussed, but they're fun and enjoyable to watch there. And that's why these are different series. They've tried to convey different things in different ways, and what Code Geass is trying to convey, they convey successfully. What Death Note is trying to convey is muddled and not really well articulated, in my opinion. So anyway, that's going to be our talk about Death Note and Code Geass for this week. We're going to do one last episode next week, which is going to be tying this back, of course, into Persona 5, because that's something that I've got to do with everything. So anyway, hope you found this episode enjoyable, and of course, as always, hope to see you guys all next time.